And we're live. Welcome, everybody, to the chat. Thanks, to everyone listening after the fact. And we're here with part three. Myself and Josh City from 86Boxing. We're here with part three of our little discussion series on the great Black Panther, Harry Wills. Josh, what's happening, brother?
Hey, good to go. Just chilling, holding it down. Of course, ready to get into this discussion as we close out this storied career.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to have you. Always great to have these great historical discussions. So, here on the screen, folks, I have this may end up being an approximation. I might actually be missing a fight, but this is approximately Harry Wills' year-to-year schedule as a professional boxer. At least the fights that are confirmed. There's always, with this era, the way the newspapers reported things, there's always some dispute about the exact number. We're just finding out what we can. We're in that area where we don't have exact reporting for every day of someone's lives. Like today, it's a lot easier, obviously, to track things. There's no box rec at that time, and even I found at different times, certain authors who do know about fights, there are omissions in the listings of fights depending on when you read what they wrote. So, but maybe Josh, maybe you could just touch a little bit on how busy Harry Wills was, just very generally in his career compared to maybe some of his contemporaries.
Yes, thanks, Random. Yeah, so as you can see on the slide that's on the screen, it kind of gives you a summation of the recorded fights that are out there for Harry Wills. And as Random mentioned, maybe give or take a few here or there, just because we're talking 100 plus years that we're going back. And it is a testament to the research, to the documentation, and everything that has gone into being able to track the sport of boxing. It is a testament that we are able to go back so far. And this includes going back to the days of bare knuckles fighting, London prize ring rules, all of that stuff. And this has carried over from year to year. And I think we, of course, in these times, benefit from being able to go to a single source or a few sources to be able to get this type of information. As relates to Harry Wills, he started out on a pretty extensive fight trajectory. I would say for the better part of his career, he was fighting a decent number of fights on a year to year basis, especially by comparison to what you see today. Of course, these days, if a fighter competes twice a year or three times a year, that could be considered a busy year in some sense. And that is a 360 shift from the way it was back in the day. In the case of Harry Wills, he had a high number of fights just compared to the relative or general heavyweight career. And we've seen a good mixture. I would use Sam Langford for comparison. If you look at the number of fights he had, which is estimated in that 300 range or over 300 range, by comparison to someone, say, like Muhammad Ali, who had, I want to say, just under 60 or around 60, somewhere in, or just under 70. Um, yeah, that's a vast difference by comparison. But of course, there are different levels of competition that individuals compete with on a year to year basis as well. Now, for Harry Wills, he kind of learned on the job in a number of his earlier fights. Uh, he fought four times in 1911. And I know by the time he reached the just over a year mark, he was he had already fought more than seven times in just over a year. And you can look at that sort of on its face level, and you can think that, okay, who is the competition that he was fighting? Some of that was a mixture of individuals who were sort of journeymen or those that were kind of at that sort of new level of competition in boxing or not as experienced in boxing. But there was also a mixture of those who did have some level of experience, and similar to how we sort of build up fighters today, in most cases at least, a similar trajectory was taken with Harry Wills. But of course, uh, not too long into his career, we started to see him shift to where he was fighting more top level competition early on before he even got to the point where he was technically in his prime. So that it's something that I believe helped him stand out against the competition. One of his early rivals, or the person who gave Harry Wills his first loss, was an individual by the name of George Kid Cotton. And if you look at George Kid Cotton just based on his record, yeah, it doesn't seem like much, nothing really to write home about or sniff at or anything of that nature. But he was just a fighter who was somewhat experienced. Overall, he only fought 37 times in his career, but one of the significance of having a person like that he was going to get. So this person was also a sparring partner of Jack Johnson. And of course, in 1911, Jack Johnson, he was the world heavyweight champion at that particular time. So if you just think about the fact that in the very start of your career, in this case with Wills, and this was his seventh fight when he first took on George Cotton. By his seventh fight, he was already in there with someone who was an active sparring partner of the world heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson. So that in itself is a testament in some sense, the fact that he was able to be in that position just early on. And I think that that first loss probably taught him a lesson in some sense. And that proved to be of benefit to him because, as with any fighter, you're only as good as sort of your competition and how you continue to develop. And of course, if he was in there with a ton of just purely soft touches, then that would be reflected as his career went on as well. But yeah, by the time he got to, so he started out in 1911, as you see there. By the time we got to 1913, he would be in with Jeff Clark, who is the Joplin Ghost. Jeff Clark, who is one of the underrated heavyweight greats from the era, who fought pretty much some of everybody, who was a name there in the world of heavyweights during that particular time. So you picture Harry Wills being young into his career and taking on someone with such prestige as a fighter in terms of he had been in there at this point. Jeff Clark had already been in there with a number of the top guys, and Harry Wills was just starting out. If I could recall correctly, from what I was able to gather, by the time he took on Jeff Clark, Harry Wills was about 10-1 as from an official record standpoint. And Jeff Clark at that particular time, he had 88 victories in well over 100 fights. So Harry Wills early into his career taking on the likes of Jeff Clark, that in itself was a testament to just the type of trajectory that Harry Wills himself was on. And I think that ultimately helps to build a fighter, build the character of a fighter, and get them prepared for taking on the best competition in the world. And being able to do so when you're early into your career definitely proves to be of benefit. So, one of the charts on the screen now kind of shows you some of those fights that took place, or at least where Jeff Clark stood on a year-to-year basis in relation to fighting Harry Wills. There's one thing that you can't really duplicate, and that's experience. So fighters come from all walks of life, and you have some who have particular traits that benefit them in the sport, but from an experience standpoint, that is something that you generally just learn as you're going through the process. So you can have all the talent, but if you ultimately don't get the experience in being able to utilize that talent, being able to manifest all of those hidden talents and attributes that would help you to stand out, then it really does nothing for you. So I think that in itself is one of the reasons Harry Wills was able to stand out and become one of those fighters that made a name for himself, not only in his time, but in history as well. And then just to think about it, as I mentioned, 1911 is when he started out. And by 1913, he took on the likes of Jeff Clark. Also, by 1913, he was in with Joe Jeanette, who was one of the best heavyweights that the sport of boxing has seen as well. And just like Jeff Clark, Joe Jeanette came in with a ton of experience as well. And this was still fairly early in the career of Harry Wills. And for those that may be familiar with, or that may not be familiar with Joe Jeanette, he's another one of those guys who, if you think about this particular time frame and who could legitimately be considered the best heavyweight in the world, Joe Jeanette's name was right there in that mix. As a matter of fact, Joe Jeanette was someone who Jack Johnson himself was quoted as stating it was his toughest fight, or is his toughest fighter to face from a competition perspective, because Jeanette was one of those guys who was very skilled, and he had long arms, of course, and he could just work behind a jab in a very effective manner. And from a boxing standpoint, you'd have been hard pressed to find many, especially any heavyweights, who brought forth sort of that total package at that particular time. And I think that's what garnered the respect of Jack Johnson as well, because he knew that it was trouble dealing with the likes of a Joe Jeanette. And so the ultimate respect that he could have paid Joe Jeanette was by stating, yeah, he was the toughest fighter for him to face. And that right there rings bells when you just think about it. So Harry Wills by 1913 was already in with the likes of Joe Jeanette. And this kind of continues on as we go through in the years, go through in Harry Wills' years, because by 1914, mind you, he started in 1911. By 1914, he was already in with Sam Langford, and he had been in with Joe Jeanette twice by 1914, or the second time was in 1914. But by that time, he had also stepped in for one of his many matchups with the great Sam Langford. And of course, for Wills, I mean, it could be considered a blessing or a curse, but in his case, a blessing in some sense. Maybe the curse of it is just dealing with such a fighter who comes with the amount of experience of a Sam Langford, and knowing that you have to go in there and kind of withstand what he brings from an offensive arsenal standpoint, and him being one of the bigger punchers in the sport's history. So I guess that's kind of a curse of it. And so you're going to be in for a tough, long contest. And Langford was one of those guys who was not easy to get him out of there as well. But this was early in his career, so he's in there with a guy like Langford, and there's no question that this had to pay dividends for him as he moved forward, because, as mentioned, He started in 1911, and by 1914, he's already in with Sam Langford, who at that time is a very seasoned pro. And he was not at his absolute peak at that particular point, this being Langford. He was still a formidable force and still a feared fighter in the sport of boxing. And that continued to be the case even as Langford got deeper into his career as well. But I think that it's pretty telling, at least from what you're seeing for those that are able to see this on screen. It's highlighting the time frame for which Wills and Sam Langford fought. We're talking from 1914 to 1922. These two individuals fought on multiple occasions, ranging, depending on the reporting, somewhere between 18 and 22 times. But just think about that, where in certain situations, especially in modern times, if you think about a fighter and them fighting someone, we often just see it once, especially if it's someone who is top caliber. Sometimes there are calls for rematches or something of that nature, and we might get a trilogy in a similar fashion to what we got with Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder. But just think about Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder fighting 22 times. It's not something you think about because you know that, of course, it's not fathomable this day and age, of course. But back then, that was the norm as far as competition was concerned, and how you were going to get the most benefit from as far as fighting and what could be generated from a financial perspective. There was no shying away from competition. So if you had to fight someone 18 times, then that essentially was just your destiny. And in the case of Harry Wills, it was just his destiny that he would be in with the likes of Sam Langford in so many fights. Now, of course, I was talking kind of gift and curse type aspect to it. So the gift of such, of course, is you're likely not going to find a better boxer during that period in general to be in the ring with outside of Sam Langford. So that's sort of the gift of it. If you can be in there and withstand Sam Langford, then of course the sky's the limit as it relates to any potential competition you could face on outside of Sam Langford, rather. And I think this certainly helped Harry Wills in terms of him building up to become the fighter that he ultimately became, and being able to share the ring with someone like Sam Langford, who's that experienced with a multitude of styles, who's fought pretty much everyone willing and available, who was the best of the era. That's something that can't be duplicated. If you think about that, because Langford, of course, he'd been in with Johnson, he'd been in with Jeanette, been in with Sam McVeigh, another one who's one of the greats from that particular time, and you name it, a host of other uh, contenders, etc., or all-time greats from that particular period. And Harry Wills, early on, relatively early in his fighting career, he's able to share the ring with Sam Langford and then continually do so as he moved forward. So you have to think that if you're fighting him in 1914, of course, as you ease more into your prime in subsequent years, then certainly that is going to play out from an experience standpoint in your favor. So Harry Wills, he kept it moving, and to think about in some of those years, he and Langford fought multiple times just in that span, that short span. When you really boil it down, uh, from 1914 to 1922, and in some of those years, he's fighting multiple times. That is a true feat in itself. So 1916, the two of them fought 4 times. You just think about that. 4 times in 1916. If you're just think about the prospect of someone today fighting their pound for pound counterpart, uh, and doing so 4 times in a single year. Uh, we're lucky if we get it just one of those fights, actually, but just think about fighting someone 4 times in a single year who is pound for pound your equal, or in some cases better than you, or has an edge on you. I mean, some would shy away from it even, but for Harry Wills, that was not the case, and I think that proved to be of benefit for him as well. Then there were other years where he would fight Langford 3 times, and then twice in a year, so on and so forth. Mind you, um, all this while Langford, of course, as mentioned, is still one of the top competitors in the sport. Now, eventually, and this was mentioned in some of the other lives that we did. This is part 3, of course, but eventually it would become there would be they would get to the point where actually Wills would start to routinely win those fights. So that happened pretty much around 19, I want to say 16, 1917, 1918, really. I would say 1918. As you can see, they drew in 1917 in what was a close fight, but pretty much from there, from 1918 to 1922, which is when they last fought, that was pretty much the best version of Harry Wills, and therefore Langford could no longer defeat him. And he was still a tough task. And at that time, Langford, of course, he had a lot of wear and tear. He was likely blind in one of his eyes, or if not, would become so shortly thereafter. But I believe he was actually blind in one of his eyes, and ultimately he had a hard career filled with a ton of fights, and something that uh, I believe Renda may have alluded to, or maybe we were discussing this beforehand, was the fact that, yeah, these are the recorded fights and kind of what's been tracked and what was covered through newspapers at the time, that had been researched and all of that stuff. But in all likelihood, there were probably a lot of back end fights or brawls or whatever it may be that were taking place sort of behind closed doors that weren't recorded, because boxing at the time, of course, was one of those sports where there's a lot of money involved, a lot of personalities, and it was not and still to this day, I guess you can say, the cleanest of sports from that perspective, as in there were people from all walks of life who wanted to be involved in the action in some type of way, from a financial standpoint. So realistically, who knows how many unrecorded fights the likes of a guy like Sam Langford would have had, that kind of added to that overall wear and tear, and added to his greatness in a sense as well. So that is something we also have to think about. And I think about the likes of Jimmy Wild, who was a fighter, who was a flyweight champion, but it was estimated he had somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 fights. Of course, all of those weren't recorded or documented, but that just puts perspective on the time where fighting in these eras was not only just a trade, but it was a lifestyle. This is how these individuals made their money, and there was no shying away from any form of fights, as it related to being able to get, or having some form of financial gain from doing such. So I'd say that to say, of course, yeah, Langford was one of the top competitors of his time, but certainly a lot of wear and tear there on that back end. And as Harry Wills got into his prime, I think that, of course, helped to attribute to the fact that he was no longer able to defeat Wills. But Harry Wills, hey, I mean, if you really think about what he ultimately became and thinking about those years between 1918 and 1922, which we kind of harkened on in the part 2 of this video previously. So if you haven't checked that out, certainly do so. But if you think about him in that particular time, yeah, he was a formidable fighting machine at that time. He had been hardened through those battles with Sam Langford, those battles with Joe Jeanette, those battles with Sam McVeigh, who was another one who sort of added to his his overall uh, his overall growth in the sport, because he also fought Sam McVeigh in 1914 as well. Let's think about that. Langford, by 1914, he's fought Langford, McVeigh, and he's fought Joe Jeanette, Jeff Clark, and he would ultimately, of course, fight Sam McVeigh multiple times as well. And I mean, you can't really duplicate that. That's just, some of the top these are the elites of the division right here, and he's fighting these guys generally around 3 and 4 years into his career, which is almost unheard of in most cases when you think about young fighters coming up. And that right there is something that, I mean, that's that experience. As I was saying, you really can't duplicate that form of experience. And it was not only them, but he's fighting other hardened sort of veterans of the sport and guys who would continue to be names in the sports and prove to be individuals that were of benefit to the growth of certain fighters. Guys like Willie Meehan, he fought Willie Meehan in 1914, who was a guy who came from the lower weights all the way up to heavyweight and gave Jack Dempsey a ton of problems, beating Jack Dempsey a couple of times as well. So he had fought him in the midst of this. Uh, Fought Mexican Pete Everett, who's a fighter who, from a record standpoint, you'll see a lot of losses. He was sort of one of those give and take fighters, but in pretty much all of his victories, all maybe except one, and we're talking like maybe around 28 victories or somewhere of that nature, just thinking about it off top. Yeah, all of them were knockouts. So he was a puncher, and he could be a bit erratic as well. So that attributed to some of his issues, this being Mexican Pete Everett. But yeah, by 1914, Langford, or rather, Wills was in with him as well. So it's just a mix, a multitude of varying styles and varying level of experiences that help to attribute to him being able to get into the place that he would ultimately be in, and where he would ultimately, and what he would ultimately become. And that's why I think that when we think about Harry Wills in his prime, which generally, as mentioned, we like to think between sort of 1918 to 1922. Yeah, he was just a force to be reckoned with. And even during that particular period, he kept fighting at just a crazy pace. Uh, we see, for those looking on the screen, 1918, he fought 7 times, going 6-0-1. 1919, 8-0. 1920, 6-0, 2 no contests thrown in the mix there. 1921, 11-0, 1 no contest thrown in the mix. 1922, 7-1-1. So we had a draw in the mix there in 1922, and the one loss that he had was basically a disqualification, and though it was the first round disqualification against Bill Tate. But that being said, uh, that's really just kind of just a notation that is there, but it really didn't have an effect on who Harry Wills was at that particular time, because, of course, Bill Tate is someone that was a big guy, a sparring partner of Dempsey's, but Harry Wills was certainly the greater fighter and could defeat Bill Tate, of course. So you just think about that. So 1918 to 1922, as he went through that, I mean, he only had that one disqualification loss, and he was just at the peak of his prowess. And I know that as Random and I were discussing, sort of as we were closing out 19, or as we were closing out part two of this Harry Wills series, we were kind of in that range where we had just discussed 1922 as we were leaning towards sort of the latter part of his career. Quick recap, of course, between that period is pretty much when the calls for a fight with Jack Dempsey came about, and there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of posturing, a lot of exchanges in the media, and a lot of excuses, etc., as to why the fight wasn't being made. And ultimately, as we know, and as we discussed in the previous episode, while Harry Wills was in his prime, an agreement could never be reached for him to actually compete with Jack Dempsey. And these two were the two best heavyweights in the world at that particular time. Some would argue that Harry Wills was the better heavyweight and the best heavyweight in the world at that particular time. He certainly had the competition and fight history to back it. But of course, in the case of Dempsey, he had the world heavyweight title. So, from a historic perspective, things tend to lean towards, or at least thoughts and sort of eyes tend to lean towards those that are tied to a belt, for instance, or some form of a title claim in this sense. But essentially, Jack Dempsey was the recognized world heavyweight champion. So for Harry Wills, that sort of piece of solidification, just from a mainstream standpoint, would have come in greater fashion if he were to have gotten a shot at Jack Dempsey and won that fight. And as mentioned, it would have been I think stylistically, it would have been a great fight. And Harry Wills, of course, was, like as mentioned, arguably the best in the world at that particular time at heavyweight. But Jack Dempsey in himself, he was no slouch, and he had the type of tools available, especially on the offensive side, that he would have certainly made it trouble for Wills as well. So that's what makes it very intriguing, because it was just stylistically a great matchup, or at least it had the potential of being a great matchup from a stylistic standpoint. And unfortunately, we didn't get to see that. And so by the time that Harry Wills got to got past 1922, and this is kind of where we kind of left off in our last conversation, we started to see less and less of Harry Wills as far as him fighting on a recurring basis, or at least with the type of schedule that he had previously had in sort of his prime years. And of course, as with anything, if you're doing less and less of it, then it's going to show. And one of the things that I mentioned in the last one as well, and it wasn't just Harry Wills. So even for Jack Dempsey, by this time, as we moved past 1922 and we started to get into the 1924 and 25 range, 1925 being a time when they actually signed to fight in some capacity. But for both of them, they had been fighting on a limited basis. There were a couple of years in there where Dempsey didn't even fight at all. And essentially, that in itself was probably going to lend to what was at one point a just great matchup on paper, being somewhat of a shell of that particular matchup. Now, of course, we'll never know, but it could have had the same type of impact, had it taken place at that particular time. But of course, uh, we do know that in all likelihood wouldn't have been the best version of either of those fighters had it actually taken place in 1925 or 1926, whatever would have been agreed upon at that particular time. And of course, it goes down in the annals of history as one of those fights that we never got to see, that would have been great for the sport just from a historic standpoint, another sort of classic rivalry for us to speak on.
Yeah, absolutely. All throughout history, they're just big fights that were either very difficult to make, weren't made till after one or both of the athletes were out of their primes, or just never happened. Like Wills, he came in 1911. Jack Johnson held the title until 1915. Although after his super fight with the unretired Jim Jeffries, he didn't fight for 2 whole years. So Wills actually joined the sport at a time when the heavyweight champion of the world, Jack Johnson, wasn't fighting. So if you think about that, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't intense stuff going on at heavyweights. So 1911, his debut year, the three other best heavyweights in the world, this was their combined schedule: Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, and Sam McVeigh. And they were also fighting each other in there as well as other people. So this is what Wills came into. This is the actual texture for a contender. What you came into is you have these three great black heavyweights fighting a furious schedule, and for the most part, only losing to each other, if at all. And then, so he came in, and so Wills, he had some fights early. He wasn't fighting as a brutal schedule as Sam Langford, but then no one is. Only maybe Harry Greb could say that as far as relative to the strength of competition. But Wills was putting in that work, and he actually sort of took over for these three guys. But it took a few years. Like, here's the Boxing Librarian. Shout out to BL. Visit boxinglibrarian.com. So here's his rankings for 1911. So when Wills joined the sport, you can see Langford, McVeigh, and Jeanette. They're the chief contenders, but Johnson wasn't fighting this year. So if you ranked like the initial ring rankings and the champion isn't automatically set apart, they would all be probably ahead of him, because it had been, Johnson's win over Jeffries. It was a big fight, but it wasn't necessarily the highest level competition, because Jeffries lost 100 pounds to come out of retirement. Like, he was old Jeffries. He wasn't Jim. He wasn't the guy that people had idolized. He was like the old fat version who was slimming down because of the money involved and because of the social pressure on him to be that white hope and take the champion out. But anyway, you see Jeff Clark on there also. So Wills came in, and he couldn't get, a fight with Jack Johnson wasn't happening, because no one was going to get the fight with Johnson when he was inactive. And then after that, he didn't, he was on the white guys tour, other than battling Jim Johnson, who was dangerous and enormous, but they fought in Paris to a draw, I believe. But battling Jim is someone that Wills fought. I think he actually lost one of them on an injury TKO. Is that right, Josh?
Yeah, he did lose.
Johnson hurt his wrist.
Yeah, he broke his wrist in that fight. Yep.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so he's fought guys like that. He fought Big Bill Tate. He's fought, like you said, Fat Boy Willie Meehan. But he wasn't getting Johnson. And once Willard beat Johnson, he fought Frank Moran, and then that was it. Took some years off, came back, lost horrifically to Dempsey. Dempsey fought some high-level fights, not hugely busy, not on the scale of these contenders. And then Dempsey took several years off before losing to Tunney. So the champion, the main world championship, the quote-unquote white championship, really, other than Johnson, he was like an exception. Like, he was like the placeholder for the white championship while the white hopes tried to take it back. But the color championship was disputed hotly between a lot of powerful fighters, and Wills was a big part of that, and took over as that dominant guy. But it wasn't instant. He had to improve on his results. Like many great fighters, he was able to improve on his results. Like, say, first time he fought the Joplin Ghost Jeff Clark, a great jabber mover, extremely mobile, to the point that Sam Langford's people didn't want a overly large ring when Langford would fight Clark. Even though Langford was a genius at walking people down, Clark was that mobile. They wanted to limit the size of the ring. You see that Wills fought to a draw with him. The second time they met, he won over 20 rounds decision, but then every other fight they had, then the next 6 fights in a row, there was a finish, a KO or a TKO. So you could see Wills, who was a big guy, he was a bigger guy naturally than Clark. He was able to impose himself the more familiar he got with someone's style. And you see that in his series with McVeigh, where the first time he lost to McVeigh over 20 rounds. This was 1914, so McVeigh had been in Australia since the end of 1911. He beat Sam Langford there, beat some other guys, Jim Barry, some Australian guys, then lost 4 times in a row to Langford. Then afterwards, he won, I think, another 4 in a row in Australia, and then he came back to the States for this fight with Wills and a fight with Badlington Johnson. And McVeigh still had enough, even after 4 defeats in a row, and then some rebound fights. He still had enough to get the best of Wills and Battling Jim. But you see later on in their thing, Wills loses a 10-round newspaper decision, but then the last 3 meetings they had, 2 of them were wins, and then they had the no contest. And I think it was stopped for inactivity. But you can see Wills improving, and the best example of that is his series with Langford. I must apologize. I think I'm missing at least 1 fight from this list. I think there's only 17 there, but just talking the general arc of their rivalry. First time they met, 10-round draw. Second time they met, Langford stopped him in 14. The third time, Wills got the best of it over 10. Then he got the best of it over 20 rounds. You'd think, oh, it's over. He's his master now. But no, he then lost in a thrilling battle, lost by 19th round KO to the great Sam Langford. This is 1916 when Langford's schedule was absolutely silly. This is possibly the toughest year anyone ever had. Langford's 1916, especially if you just look at Langford's Hall of Fame opponents. Harry Wills, Sam McVeigh, Harry Wills, Sam McVeigh, Harry Wills, Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh. That is a crazy. Plus, he fought Battling Jim and Jeff Clark and some other guys that year. So Langford was fighting a crazy schedule. He was still winning most of his fights, and Wills was able to come in and gradually over their rivalry, Wills got better and better, and Langford was leaving his prime. The first time I could find that Langford came in heavy was overly heavy. It was 1913. I think he lost to Gunboat Smith, which he then avenged, but he wasn't in the best shape, and he came back in supreme shape and destroyed him. But Wills was getting better and better. So by 1918, when Wills is absolutely in his prime, he's able to routinely get the best of the last draw that Langford, the best result Langford got. The latest one was 1917. He fought in Wills to a draw over 12 rounds. But say after that, it's all wins, although not all stoppages. Unlike his rivalry with Jeff Clark, with Langford, he was a little ball of muscle. This guy was incredibly tough. And even as late as 1920, when Wills gets one of his many wins over him, Langford, I think he had 20. I can't remember exactly, but I'll show you. This was Langford's year, mostly wins. This is a comeback year for Langford. There he is in 1920 on the right-hand side, a little ball of muscle. So the fact that, when fighters are inactive, you never know how shot they are, right? Because if you lose a fight and then you don't fight again for a bunch of time and then you lose again, you say this guy's no good. Who knows? He might lose to anyone. In the case of Langford, his schedule was generally such that he was still proving himself to be in the top handful. It's just that Wills could get the best of him. And occasionally other guys could get good results, game plan around his failing eyesight in one eye, and he had lost to Lee Anderson that year as well. But generally, he was going to beat anyone who wasn't elite, even when he was long past his best. We see that other times in history, like a late career Joe Louis, or the last fight of Rocky Marciano, where he was already having back troubles, or lots of these great fighters, they get past their best, but they're still among the best. Mike Tyson, Holyfield, these guys, they're that good. They have skills and experience that they can draw from. Langford drew from his unparalleled high-level experience to still get some good results, but not against Harry Wills. But that's, Langford had his first heavyweight fight in 1905. He fought the great Joe Jeanette, the first of 14 times, if I'm not mistaken. So, by 1911, when Wills debuted, Langford had already been fighting up the weights for several years. And so by the time Wills hits his prime, Langford's 13 or 14 years deep. into the heavyweight ranks and had a ton of fights. But it's worth noting that, like, okay, so if you look here, the first time they fought, Langford already had 101 wins, 26 draws against 10 losses. That's 1st of May 1914. By this last one in this listing, January 1922, Langford's won another 71 fights from the middle of 1914 to the beginning of 1922. He went from having 101 wins to 172 wins. That's a whole fight career's worth of wins to add to his already incredible record. So Langford these weren't meaningless wins. It's just that with the champions, I should say, with Johnson, Willard, and Dempsey not active, you could have all these wins over one of the greatest fighters of all time, and it wouldn't do anything because the champions didn't want the fight. And so with Wills, it's unfortunate he didn't get his opportunity. He did invest the money he made in real estate and lived a comfortable life. So it's not a rags to riches to rags story like Langford, or an early death like McVeigh or Battling Jim. He lived out his life like Joe Jeanette with some money, and he definitely earned that money, because this schedule right here, if you think about when did Dempsey debut? Was it 13 or 14, or am I just totally confused?
Good question.
Do you know offhand?
I don't know offhand. I don't.
I think it might have been 14. But in Will's schedule, you can see the main figures that Dempsey absolutely did not face on his way up to a world title shot. Like, he sidestepped many of the toughest guys that were in that bracket. Wills didn't have that luxury, and this is the live gate era. So between the crowd bringing you gate money, ticket money to split, and side bets with the management or the other fighter, that was where the money was generally coming from, although film rights were getting more and more prominent moving forward. But Wills, so he had to fight the tough schedule. So this is obviously not a long rivalry compared to Langford, but he did have 5 fights against McVeigh, 5 fights against one of the most dangerous punchers of his generation. And then all those fights against Langford, the most concussive puncher of that era. And this is not just us saying this. This was in the newspapers. This was widely acclaimed. Langford was the hardest hitter, just as the great Bob Fitzsimmons had been in a prior generation. Langford took over that mantle, but he earned that mantle with all these finishes. I mean, Langford's up there in Archie Moore territory, just below Archie Moore in knockouts, including knocking out lots of Hall of Famers. So pretty incredible strength of competition for Wills that didn't result in a title shot, but these rivalries forged him by 1918, you could say he's seen it all. He's seen like the great movers, the great jabber mover like the Joplin Ghost Jeff Clark. He's fought the most concussive puncher and experienced of the crew, Sam Langford. He's also fought a very powerful puncher himself, Sam McVeigh, who could also fight on the retreat, very intelligent fighter for all his athleticism. And then he's fought the great Joe Jeanette. He's fought one of the great cardio machines that ever lived, and someone who could fight on the jab. But if you see the footage of the 10th fight between Langford and Jeanette, this guy could jump in with the jabs. He could leap in with jabs to the head or body. He wasn't just circling away, whereas Jeff Clark was more evasive. Joe Jeanette could get in there and do work, but he could build off the jab like no other. So, Wills has seen just so much. And, his main achievement, because he didn't get the world title shot, but the colored world title shot, separate from the white title, he was the guy who took over from Sam Langford as the most feared fighter. And Jack Dempsey, in retrospect, in some quarters, that must have seemed embarrassing. They didn't want to fight. I know as a manager, I think in 22, had announced they were going to fight. Then he came back and announced that Dempsey wouldn't fight at all that year. I think I was 22 or 23. So, but that doesn't mean, so if you see Will's career sort of like get less and less busy, part of that is the champion isn't fighting at all. So Wills has this position and he wants to maintain that position. We see some of that today where the contenders are reluctant to have a whole bunch more fights than the champion because they raise their risk of losing that opportunity, where the champ's being very selective. And today, when we had this collection of top heavyweights, well, how many times are they fighting each other? And how many of their fights are against other guys just who are around? Fury, we got different guys doing that. So this is an old pattern that happened, but Wills, you can say he fought 3 of the 4 greatest heavyweights of the generation that he emerged into. Now be Joe Jeanette, Sam Langford, Sam McVeigh. Didn't get to fight Johnson, but then Johnson didn't want to fight guys who were even more experienced and career successful than Wills was at that point. Once Johnson lost the title, the talk sort of evaporated. The focus steered to other matchups. Just like when Dempsey lost to Tunney, and then a mid-30s Wills lost to, was it Sharkey? The talks kind of evaporated, So there's a reason that he was less and less busy. But he was able to improve his results. He got better and better, and he hit his prime. And then he was like Langford and the other guys. He started being avoided. He did get to fight some top guys, but it wasn't like, it's like the guys who need the money. They're much more willing. The guys who haven't got their opportunity yet, so they're all scrambling with each other. And sometimes the champion's just sitting there saying, "Show me something," or going off to do movies or doing speaking engagements, making more money not fighting than fighting, which we also see today, where they hold out for more and more money. But Wills, like you saw Dillian White when his fight with Big Baby Miller fell through, and they offered Dillian White $5 million to fight him. He turned it down. He held out. He said, "No, I'm not going to take the fight at this time." Wills, you give him the equivalent of $5 million to fight any of these guys. Like they were fighting for much less. So, in a way, it's sad that structurally the money wasn't trickling down very much at all. But on the other hand, Wills was one of the ones who made the most of it and left with money. So, but as far as competition prowess, Harry Wills deserves all the respect. And I would say, based on the strength of competition, you could say that it's quite possible he was the best. When he was at his best, he was the best of that generation. And it doesn't hurt that case that Dempsey and his people avoided that fight. You know what I mean, Josh? Like, you're the one ducking the other guy, and you both have this body of work, and the public, they did a poll of like 500 newspapers, and this was the fight the public most wanted. Tommy Gibbons coming in second. So this isn't just something we're saying now because we're like trying to rework the matrix after the fact. The public wanted this, which undercuts the idea that the public wouldn't support a white champion versus a black champion, which was the excuse made after the race riots in 1910 when Johnson beat Jeffries. But the public wanted this fight. They wanted to see Dempsey and Wills fight. They wanted that rivalry. It just wasn't in the cards, and so Wills he just got sidestepped by certain guys enough that he didn't get his world opportunity. But man, he put the work in. Were there so I'm gonna shoot it back to you, Josh, because I was just talking endlessly over here. We're gonna do a part 4. I'm not sure exactly what we'll cover in part 4. I'll throw it up on the channel. I'm running out of time. I got about 5 minutes. Is there anything you want to add as far as his rivalry? Because we didn't get to go too deep into the Langford rivalry. Maybe we'll revisit these, and I'll get that extra fight in there, I promise. But as far as like Wills was long-limbed, Langford was very stocky, but had respectable arms. He still had a reach disadvantage, but not as much as you would think from a 5'7.5" guy. Stylistically, do you think there were any tougher matchups for Wills than Langford, considering the physical attributes and their particular styles they developed? Or do you think Langford remained like his toughest matchup?
Yeah, great question. Just looking at it from the standpoint of those that were available at that time and who he actually fought, I do think that Sam Langford was in all likelihood his toughest matchup, just given the fact that, as you mentioned, conventional wisdom would make you think that a guy of Will's size would be able to handle someone like Langford. But Langford was sort of a unicorn, an enigma in himself, in the fact that this was a guy who was only about 5'7", and he started out at lower weight, and he was able to carry his power up to heavyweight, even though realistically he wasn't even a big heavyweight. Just if you just think about it from a size and weight perspective, because I believe that Harry Wills outweighed him in every contest that they fought, and Langford usually was under 200 pounds. In any instance, when he was over 200 pounds, it was all in likelihood because he probably wasn't in the top shape at that particular point or for that particular fight. But that being said, Wills was a legitimately big guy for his time. He had super long arms. And of course, when they teach you about boxing, one of the things they talk about is the jab, and that being sort of the tone setter. And of course, Wills did have that. And with Langford, I mean, he as I mentioned was just such an enigma. He he had been in with so many styles. I believe Langford is the type of guy who, if you just look at a boxing career, you just lay down everything fight by fight. I'm sure there was probably no style that he hadn't seen. Because if you fight as often as he fought, that type of experience, then you're going to see so many varying styles at that particular time. And contrary to conventional wisdom, despite the fact that we didn't have video or we don't have a ton of video from that time, and of course we have the luxury of having video of more modern fighters, there were guys back there who were back then, Langford being one of them, of course, who was very skilled, who had learned boxing from some of the greats of the past. There is a thought or notion that, of course, James Corbett, rather, Gentleman Jim, there's a thought that he's the first scientific boxer or whatever, and just that boxing was, I guess, some kind of wild and unready. It was some kind of wild and unskilled, just brawl type of just unstructured type of sport at that particular time. Now you could say that's the case in terms of the back end stuff, but as far as the fighters there, a lot of them don't get credit for being skilled or having learned some of the just the nuances of being a actual boxer because of the fact that it was early on in the days of boxing. But contrary to belief, you had a lot of guys who were of that sort of scientific ilk who learned the sport from some of the greats in the past and who knew all the tricks and trades of actually putting together punches and being able to feint and use distance, things of that nature. So Langford, in all likelihood, would have seen some of every style that would have been available in boxing at that particular time, or what we would think would be a style that would be of trouble for many today. So I think that
100%.
in itself makes it the way it is as far as him being the toughest test for Wills.
Yeah, Langford had seen it. Last thing I'll say before we call it, folks. I'm sorry we started an hour late. That was my fault. Langford had seen it all before he was even at heavyweight. You know, he fought aggressive fighters like Patsy Sweeney. He fought guys who were technical but roughhouses like Elbows McFadden. He fought like a great body puncher and another like a crouching fighter like Barbados Walcott, one of the great crouching fighters of all time. You've seen defensive master Jack Blackburn. He fought a very clinch capable fighter, young Peter Jackson. I mean, it goes on and on. He fought like the Whirlwind, Stanley Ketchel. And this is all before Wills had even debuted in the sport. Langford had seen it. Big rough guys like Jim Barry or big hulking dudes like Big Sandy Ferguson, Al Kubiak. Like Langford's experience level was just ridiculous. Most people can't get that experience before their body completely abandons them. Langford was extra tough and also very, very skilled. So the big guys might have a more dangerous punch, but they're easier to avoid than the little guys. Langford always took a lesson from his first career loss, his first points loss to Danny Duane, a New York lightweight who just came in with a furious attack and outsped him so much that he, even like a decade or at the end of his career in the 20s, he said that Danny Duane was the fastest guy he ever fought. So fighting the big guys, Langford, with his toughness and his punching power, his compensating power, was able to compete above his level. And as he filled out, even when he started coming in heavy sometimes, 1913 when he got back from Australia, probably all the year, he was still extremely capable at a world-class level. And that lasted into 1920, where Langford's still fighting a slew of fights and mostly winning. Pretty crazy stuff. Josh, I'm afraid we have to call it. Folks, thanks so much for coming in and just spending a few minutes with us talking about this great fighter. We're going to obviously do more on our Will series. I'll throw it up on the channel when it's time. But yeah, this is a great fighter, and we can't celebrate these guys enough because it's not, there's no like official body that's just spending its energy celebrating these great fighters. So we have to do it. We have to do it on a fan level and historical enthusiast level. But there's a brief overview from us on some of his rivalries. We'll get into, in part 4, we'll probably go through the last of his career fight by fight from 22 onward. And we'll also maybe I'll load up a little bit of footage of some of the opponents, the limited footage we have. Got limited footage of like McVeigh and Langford and Battling Jim and Jeanette, but I'll throw some of those clips up and we'll look at some of the things we see stylistically. Maybe that'll support your point on they were clever fighters. They were obviously going all the way back. They were very clever fighters. It's not rocket science to think if you can't out-muscle a guy, then you have to out-finesse him. Jeff Clark would be a great example of that. Lots of experience that he got against the Joplin Ghost, who was, after his prime, the Joplin Ghost was brought in to help other fighters train. He was brought into training camps because he was still so smooth. Even when he couldn't take the punishment in a professional fight, but skill-wise, he was right up there. So that was true of Jeanette and Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. A lot of these great fighters, they still had a lot to give after they were finished fighting. Jack Blackburn's a great example of that, with what he turned Joe Louis into. But we're going to call it. Josh, thanks, brother. It's really great to have you on the channel once again. I look forward to doing part 4.
Thank you. Anytime, my friend. So yes, we'll be in contact, and thank you for everyone who's listening back.
All right, folks. Thanks for joining us. Take care now.